talk tonight. My name is Kevin Keane. I'm Education Officer with the 1916 Societies, and we're the Sean Houston Dublin branch of 1916 Societies. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. Please take note of emergency exits. The barman asked for any glasses to be dropped up to the bar when you're finished, please. And please make sure all phones are turned off or silent as well. These things aren't cheap to put on. We don't really have much of a revenue income, so we'll ask, if possible, could you please leave a donation at the end? Or also, we have a couple of badges for sale as well. These things, this is a debate tonight, it's a forum, it's a conversation. We would ask people to keep your comments respectful at the end. There's going to be a question and answers feedback forum as well at the end, so everyone can get their say at the end. But as I said, you're going to probably hear a few opinions that you probably won't like tonight, but that's what these things are about. Otherwise it wouldn't be a debate and you just have confirmation bias. So again, please respect any opinions that you don't hear tonight. Not respect them, but respect the individual, and you use your the gift of the gab to take them down if you'd like, please. And that's about it really. So we're going to start off here. I'll give Tim Pat the mic here first to kick us off, okay?
I don't mind. Whichever you have.
We probably have an idea what the feedback is going to be like at the end, so we may as well keep Liam's opinions fresh in people's minds anyway, okay?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I should just make a point that, I just want to make one point that the dark glasses are not because I want you to view me as a youthful version of Bono, but because I'm having difficulty with my eyes. And that said, I'm very pleased to talk about 1916. I don't quite know what format is here, or what, I know that the sort of attitude of our guest. I've read what he had to say about the proclamation and so on. It's, yeah, okay. This is about the famine. There was a dearth of knowledge. What is the 1916 doing talking about the famine in the anniversary year? Well, anyway, well, you'll find it very hard to talk to the people who are most affected by the famine. But anyhow, I would still just go back to 1916 for me, because of course it was inspired by the famine to many reasons. I mean, the area that Michael Collins came from, you know, was literally piled with corpses, and the entire motivation of these people with the Fenians would have come from the famine. And 1916 was probably the next big event in our history to compare with it. But as to the famine itself, as with 16, I do not really understand the mentality of people who would really, if they were let, have us believe that this wasn't a famine, that it was in fact a 19th century precursor of the Scarsdale diet or something of that order, or that it can be considered in isolation from government policy, from certain key personalities. It's the most unfortunate concatenation of events from the point of view of the Irish peasantry and the Irish nation generally, that you had in the cabinet some of the most powerful Irish landowners and biggest. Lord Palmerston, for example, would shine by his own light. You also had the liberal government, the liberal sort of attitude that if a man was poor, it was largely his own fault. And laissez-faire, the summation of a lot of the economic doctrines of the time that didn't interfere with the market. You had the overcrowding on the land, absolute shambles, the subdivision of land. And you had the very strange mind and personality of this brilliant but heartless civil servant, Charles Trevelyan. Now, in an era, just consider his influence. There are some people who would say that Trevelyan did not have an influence on the famine. He was only a civil servant. He was implementing government policy. And certainly if you look at the laissez-faire philosophy, and if you look at the liberals, you could see where that would be coming from. But in fact, at a time when privilege was rampant, when, for example, the Jolly Rogers or the Hooray Henry type people from landed gentry families, great families, were given commissions in the army or could buy them, which meant that they would end up sometimes on battlefields commanding people in a situation of shot and shell and cavalry bearing down on them, or grape shot coming from cannons, absolutely unable to deal with, and just leaving their peasantry there and fleeing. In a situation like that, when people bought commissions, the civil service, such as it was very much the same. The good name, the good family got you the job. And Trevelyan actually had so much influence, so much respect, that he was given the job of reforming the civil service. And he made it a meritocracy. And exams, etc., merit. And today's civil service is pretty well his. Now, you wouldn't find a civil servant with that kind of influence very often. Curiously, you would find it in Ireland in a benign way with T.K. Whittaker. If you were to go back to the 60s and the 50s, the country was drifting on the rocks. De Valera had gone past it. He was able to hold on to power, but all this for what? He couldn't have answered. And Whittaker produced an economic plan. They backed it, and Le Mas emerged, and we had the 1960s and the semi-revival. Unfortunately, Trevelyan was the antithesis of this. He wanted to get the people out, make the land fit for usage. He also thought that unclaimed, said, and he's there in record, this was divine providence wreaking havoc on these people. And it was the fault of the Irish and all the general things. And he was spokesperson for the Liberal government, who had, for example, they had the communications artefact at the time was the London Times, which in those days would have been more than the equal of the BBC, Sky, you name it, all put together. The London Times, or the Times of London, the Times, really was the organ that counted. And people like Woods, the Chancellor, Palmerston, Trevelyan himself, of course, they actually wrote the editorial sometimes in that paper. And the famous editorial about hoping that someday the Celt on the banks of the Shannon would be as rare as the Red Indian on the banks of the Hudson was written in those days with that attitude. Along with that, there was the whooping up of the providential nature that God, Christ, whoever had brought this upon the Irish as a punishment for their fecklessness and their overbreeding and their laziness and so forth. So it was very easy to introduce policies such as, for example, there is some talk you'll find here and there. People say, oh, you couldn't accuse the government of genocide. Didn't they bring in the soup kitchens? They did for a year or thereabouts, and as soon as they worked, discovered to their horror that they were working, keeping people alive, ergo keeping them on the land, they dropped that policy, closed the food depots, grain being distributed, and they went for this work scheme where you only got paid, sort of a dole scheme if you worked. And women and children were expected to do this, whereas the able-bodied people were only, the able-bodied men were admitted to the workhouses. The shambles of the work system we didn't have, Ireland didn't have, like a welfare system. And unfortunately the system that was set up depended very much on the landlords with unions, as they call them. Places divided up into unions, and it depended on the wealth of the landlord, or the ability or the willingness, whether the union was founded or not, funded or not. The result, of course, of these workhouses became places of absolute horror. One of the things it's well worth doing, going to the one in Skib, Clonakilty, Skibbereen, which, of course, you know the ballad of. And one of the most interesting exhibits there, it's not pictures of emaciated people or corpses or mass graves. It's a flag. I mean a flag in the sense of a building flag, or something you see in an old Irish kitchen. It's 2 foot square. And that was the amount of space somebody had in a workhouse. They were built for a couple of hundred people, dependent on the landlord, and said they would be set by thousands. And this was presided over by the most powerful government in the world. If you were to study the explosion of knowledge in Victorian England, the Great Exhibition, the acquisition, say, of Hong Kong, the Opium Wars, all of these things, with the huge Irish landlord, the moving engine, Palmerston, behind it, you get an idea of how insignificant an Irish peasant must have looked. So, during the famine, as it progressed, more and more the mantra of the Chancellor Exchequer, who controlled the purse strings, advised by Trevelyan, quote, advised, in fact directed by Trevelyan. Contemporary sources say that he was completely led by him. The solution became what was known as, quote, natural causes. Now, if you put people out of a cottage on a Mayo hillside, or it doesn't even have to be a hillside, a moor like in Belmullet in Mayo, which not accidentally became the worst famine-hit area for mortality. If you put them out in that situation, young, old, middle-aged, barefooted, such a thing as rain gear not even invented, you put them out on a Mayo hillside, grandmother, baby in arms, it won't be very long before, quote, natural causes, unquote, take care of the situation. And that didn't happen for a day or a year. The feeding, the soup kitchens, lasted for a year. But the famine went on from 1845 to 1852. And in fact, it's a very arbitrary date at 52. If you continue, I mean, what is a famine? People were still dying of hunger in great numbers for decades after that. One estate, for example, modern Connemara, was owned by the man we know as Humanity, Dick Martin. He founded the Royal Humane Society for the Protection of Animals. And the man he was eccentric, would be stretching the word. But anyway, he went bankrupt and his family lost the estate. Now that estate stretched really from outside Galway out to Killery Harbour in Mayo, with Galway Bay on the left and the mountains of Connemara to the right. And there were some 200,000 people living in that estate. That estate was put up for auction. And in the auctioneer's prospectus was a reassurance to prospective buyers. In the early 60s this occurred, because after the legal things had to be settled and so on before it could be legally put up for sale. In the prospectus there was a note from the auctioneer saying, we want to reassure prospective buyers that the numbers of tenants mentioned in the 1841 census no longer live on the estate. The 200,000 people were dead or gone to America. Now, there is a concept in mathematics called accelerated mortality. And the best way to explain that I can give you is, for example, if you took the recent heat wave some years back in France, people were found dead in cars, in their apartments, and so on, from heart attacks, from strokes. Now, it was clearly caused by heat, but it wasn't. This man has been hired by the opposition. It was clearly caused as a result of an event. It wasn't directly heat. They didn't say have burning faces or sunburn, but they had heat stroke and so on. So some acceleration of mortality had occurred. And by that term, they worked out how many people were killed by France's recent heat wave. Now that methodology was applied long before the heat wave by, basically he was a Norwegian demographer and historian, Miklos is his name, Miklor. And he, and Joe Lee, who's an Irish historian, but basically Miklor, who did the original research, and he worked out that the original calculation, which we all learned as school children, of 1 million dead and 1 million emigrated, was completely false. It was more likely 2 million dead. And with averted births that weren't born, or people who died on the cotton ships and so on, that the 1 million emigrated was far more than that. Lives were lost. Now there was approaching 9 million people in Ireland at the time of the famine. And after it, it was down to 6, and it has diminished ever since. This is an extraordinary fall in the population. When you're talking about something on the attack on the Jews by the Nazis. And it went on under the most efficient government in the world at the time, ahead in architecture, ahead in naval architecture, ahead in weaponry, planning, in agriculture. And yet, we are supposed to believe it happened somehow or another because of Irish recklessness, or despite the good intentions. It was deliberately a policy of genocide, to get the people off the land. There's a good deal of correspondence between the various ministers. For example, one letter between the Chancellor of the Exchequer Woods and the Spring Rice, who was a large landowner around Wicklow and Kerry, and he was horrified that the degradation was occurring. And he mentioned one particular case of a man with 42 acres, one of his best tenants of cattle, and he met him driving the road, going away. And he brought this to the attention of the Chancellor. Chancellor, I don't at all view the loss of your tenants as a tragedy or anything approaching that. Are we not all agreed that the solution of the land problem is to get the people, the tenantry, out? And several other pieces of correspondence of that nature. It was one of the crimes of the 19th century, and I think that the whole colonial cringe, which still affects us to a certain extent, both in our teaching of history, in the provincial approach some people take to our history, that would try and deny that it was genocide. This efficient, super efficient government couldn't have stopped that. For example, the soup kitchens were very, very influential. That is absolutely part, I think, of the colonial cringe. The famine was genocide, and it left us with a lot of the attitudes we still have, cap touching and saying, it could be worse, and so forth. And it should be recognised as one of the great evils of 19th century Ireland, or indeed of the world. And I would say completely and categorically that the state of New York, under Governor Pataki was completely right to include the study of the Irish famine under Holocaust studies. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So I'd like to thank Tim Pat there for his contribution, and I'm going to pass you over to Professor Liam Kennedy now.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me if I stand up? I prefer standing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
You okay without the mic?
No, with the mic. I think it'll be on.
Fine either way. Good.
With the
Is
mic.
it okay? Yeah. May not be. Thanks, and thanks to you guys as well. For that presentation. It might be helpful if I started with a personal anecdote, and I hope I can remember this in a concise form. Anyhow, during the 150th anniversary of the Great Famine, Belfast City Council, I live in Belfast City Council decided to mark the famine in Belfast by unveiling a stained glass window depicting various famine scenes. Now, that was a controversial decision, as you can imagine. The motion was proposed by Sinn Féin, backed by the Alliance Party, by the SDLP, and by some unionists, including Dr. Chris Legimsey, one of the few unionist councillors who turned up on the night of the unveiling. Chris is a very good historian, by the way. Now, the next step was to invite somebody to give a lecture at just prior to the unveiling, and to good or ill fortune, I was invited to give the talk. Now, as it turned out, the particular day, it was incredibly busy teaching-wise, so I kind of rushed down to City Hall. I'd written a script, but I hadn't had a chance to look at it, having just bashed it out a few days earlier. Met by the Lord Mayor, who was very welcoming, the Alliance Lord Mayor, as I remember. David Alderdice, brother of Lord Alderdice. Anyhow, I said, look, David, I need to look over my notes. I said, fine. Took me into the Lady Mayor's office, parlour, which is called parlour. Probably one of the few privileged ones to enter there. I was just opening my file when in through the door came the Sinn Féin councillor, somebody I know quite well actually, get on well with, Tom Hartley. He was a very good local historian, and we've talked about Irish history down the years. Anyhow, Tom said to me, Liam, we're a bit worried about what you might say. Some of the lads back there are a little worried about this. And I said, Tom, there's no problem. You proposed the idea of the stained glass window. I think it was a great idea. He said, well, you know you're involved in these campaigns against punishment beatings and shootings and exiling and so on. And I said, oh, don't worry, Tom, there's only one tiny reference to that in the talk. He said, oh my God, and went out. Anyhow, we went into the hall where the lecture was to be given. I was kind of underdressed, everybody else was in ceremonial robes. And I gave my speech. And I did at one point mention that in making judgments about how the Great Famine had been handled by the British authorities, and indeed by others, and I'll come back to that in a moment, I said, you know, we might also bear in mind that in this city, at this time, mainly young men, some children, are routinely beaten by a crowbar brigade from either the loyalist paramilitarism or from Republican paramilitarism. And indeed, exiling hasn't stopped in Ireland, because in fact, young lads, typically, working class estates, loyalist Belfast, or Republican Belfast, are routinely told to get out of the country or be shot. But then I went on to talk about the famine in Ireland, the famine in Ulster, and the famine in Belfast City, and also in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. So I finished after about 20 minutes. Thought, well, okay. And then we had a discussion. The first person to get up was a tall, bearded man from West Belfast. I won't try to do the accent because I can't do it. And he said, "That's the most revisionist lecture I've ever heard in my life." And it wasn't Tim Coogan. And the... It's strange that I have a beard. No, this was definitely black bearded in those days. You can guess probably. So there was some more discussion, and then we had the unveiling of the window, and then a reception afterwards. Now, it was my ill fortune that, given the subject of the famine, normally City Hall puts on great banquets. In fact, I think we just had nibbles and tea and coffees and water, as befitted the occasion. Anyhow, Tom Hartley came over to me, and I said, "Tom, it wasn't that bad, was it?" He said, "It was even worse than we expected." But then he said, laughingly, quoted something from Oscar Wilde, and we parted on reasonably good terms. The point of this is, and there are several points one can draw from that experience. One is that the famine is hugely controversial. Secondly, it divides Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland. A typical Unionist response came from Sammy Wilson, who said there was no famine no famine in Belfast, and that this was simply a ploy by Sinn Féin to wrongfoot Unionists. Sinn Féin and related nationalists clearly took a very different view. So what I'm saying is, these very traumatic events in Irish history often have quite polarised historical interpretations. And indeed, on the Unionist case, on the Unionist side, until relatively recently, there's been a kind of amnesia regarding the Great Famine. Much like the amnesia we had in the Republic of Ireland in relation to the tens of thousands of Irish soldiers who fought for Britain and Ireland in the First World War. Fortunately, we're getting beyond that. And so, I welcome those kinds of debates, both on the famine, on the First World War, and indeed, what Tim Pat started in 1916. We might even end on that. I suppose the other lesson to draw from all of that is that the study of history and the reception of history into Irish society, and indeed this is true of other societies, but particularly in the case of Irish society, it's very much a dialogue between the present and the past. So the politics of the present are heavily following interpretations of the past. Now, moving on, and actually on an ecumenical note, and I haven't always been kind to Tim Pat, and the other way around as well, but let's just list some of the things we agree on, I think, and Tim Pat, you can raise an objection if I'm misrepresenting any of your positions. I think we would both agree, and probably most of us in this room, that the famine is the most traumatic event in modern Irish history, much more so than 1916, the economic war, the land war of the later 19th century, and so on. It's the most traumatic event in modern Irish history, in which 1 million died of famine or famine-related diseases, and 1 million emigrated. So 1 million dead, 1 million fled. I think we probably also agree that it inaugurated huge changes in Irish society. I mean, the decline of agricultural labourers and cottiers, that's very much a product of the famine, including the mass evictions that Tim Pat mentioned in the Mayo landscape. And one could generalise that with variation to some of the other parts of Ireland. It also hugely accelerated emigration out of Ireland. I mean, it's not the case that emigration started with the Great Famine. It was right back into the 18th century, pioneered by Ulster Presbyterians, and then spread more widely in Irish society. But the Great Famine certainly accelerated the extent of emigration. It, to a large extent, if you take the half century after the Great Famine, it fashioned that, in many respects, farmer-dominated politics that you get by the early 20th century. It accelerated the decline of the Irish or Gaelic language on Gaeilge, though that decline had set in even before the famine, but it certainly accelerated that. And indeed, those who suffered most from the Great Famine, proportionately speaking, were Irish or Gaelic speakers. Because, as we know, the regional impact of the Great Famine was particularly in the western half of Ireland. That's where you got most Irish or Gaelic speakers. So, and I mean, there's Karl Marx's comment, some of you would be familiar with, that only poor devils died during the Great Famine. Now, that's an exaggeration, of course, but it's got a substantial element of truth in it. That it's the cottiers, the labourers, to a lesser extent, working people in the towns who fell victim to the famine. And we probably also agree, perhaps this might be the last, for the moment, point of agreement, on the intensity of the famine. You know, as famines go, the Irish famine of the 1840s, An Gorta Mor, as mentioned on the publicity, the excess mortality during the famine, those dying of famine or famine-related diseases, probably amounts to about 15% of the population. A population of about 8.5 million. I don't buy the argument, it was close to 9 million. But yeah, very close to 8.5, I would suggest, and that's more recent revisions by Prof. Really the outstanding historian of the Irish famine, and indeed of famines internationally. And, you know, for 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 of the population die of famine-related causes. That places the Irish famine internationally as one of the worst in the human record. And bears comparison, actually, with the 1740-41 famine in Ireland, another massive killer. Now, could I move on from that to confront, really, in terms of tonight's debate, I think, what is the crucial issue, which is culpability in the Great Famine. And Tim Pat has argued eloquently that it was genocide. Now, in terms of accepted definitions of genocide, if you use the UN Convention on Genocide, which indeed Tim Pat quotes in full, as I recall, in his book, The Famine and Plot. If you look at the wording, and I think that's with incredible efficiency, I've just seen it in front of you. Article 2 of that convention states that, and I quote, genocide means any of the following acts, this is the crucial bit, committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. And it goes on to say, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and so on. But the key phrase there centres on intentionality. And I do not see evidence for all the waywardness and culpability of Westminster policies and policy making. I do not see intentionality there. And really, you cannot have, an accidental genocide. There's got to be intentionality there. So, in terms of the hierarchy of culpability, let me say it lies heavily with the Cabinet of Westminster, particularly the Whig Liberal administration from summer 1846 onwards. Though we do need to bear in mind that Lord John Russell's government was a minority government. It was actually weakened by the general elections in Ireland and Britain in August 1847. Incidentally, this is a point where an interesting point which I've only become more aware of recently through the work of Brian Walker. The 1847 general election in Ireland, kind of topical as we're facing into a general election in this part of Ireland. Again, it's part of the island. Hardly anyone mentioned the Great Famine from the various platforms, and that really is striking. There are some, but not many, and that's striking because, of course, you have O'Connellite party contesting that election, but they, of course, are in alliance with the Whig Liberal administration. They have certain criticisms, but not all that strong. It is curious. The Westminster Parliament more widely bears a responsibility, but I think there is also a responsibility resting on Irish MPs at Westminster, Tory MPs, Whig Liberal MPs, and Daniel O'Connell's 40 or so followers in the House of Commons. They are more concerned with political and constitutional issues than with the great issue which is facing the people, and that is, abject poverty, famine conditions, and death. And even the young Irelanders, who, rather like some of the quotes the men of 1916, we rather uncritically extol as heroes, that's Chinchilla, the young Irelanders, some of their policies are, almost unbelievable. I mean, some young Irelanders, not all, saying things like, we do not want to accept British charity. This is the 10 millions which the British government, roughly 10 million, spent on famine relief for the public works programs to begin with, and then the soup kitchens. Soup kitchens which, at their height in August 1847, were feeding 3 million people daily. I mean, that puts soup kitchens in the early 21st century into the halfpenny place. 750,000 at its height in public work programs. Now, there were all kinds of problems with those public work programs, even with the soup kitchens. And, Tim Pat makes a valid point when he says they lasted for less than a year, not in the case. They could have been extended, and indeed should have been extended. But those are not actions which are compatible with notions of genocide. The young Irelanders literally had no effective anti-famine policies. Their high minds were elsewhere by and large. We might talk a little bit more about John Mitchell, the more complicated story there, but let's leave that for the moment. But I would also, if we're talking about the hierarchy of culpability, moving down that hierarchy, I would also talk about the Irish middle classes. We're talking about the urban middle classes. 3 minutes. Yep, thank you. And I won't say you're on the side of Tim Pat.
Sure, me one of those ejection notices.
Eviction.
You've been all I've been evicted.
Now, so in the towns of Ireland, reasonably well-off Catholics in northern counties, well-off Protestants. It seems to me they could have done more. And could I also mention the Catholic Church? And this is not an anti-clerical point at all. And some of you will have seen the film The Feed, where the Bull McCabe says to the parish priest, no priest died during the Great Famine. Now, that is simply nonsense. Priests did die during the famine, which was on, and indeed Church of Ireland ministers and Presbyterian ministers died during the Great Famine. Nonetheless, in relation to the Roman Catholic Church to begin with, I'm surprised by the fact that church building went on during the Great Famine, when you would have thought a more immediate priority was feeding the poor. And I would also be critical of someone who was generally treated rather uncritically, and that is Archbishop McHale, Archbishop Tuam Diocese. He spoke well on the famine and on the inefficiency, maladministration policies that weren't working in relation to the famine. Very good on those issues. However, on the other hand, one of the escape routes out of Ireland in the 1840s was emigration. And McHale was very opposed to the starving parishioners getting out of Ireland. He also devoted huge energies, as did the Archbishop from my own diocese, Cashel and Emily, Dr. Slattery, who said relatively little about the Great Famine, but said an awful lot about the godless colleges, higher education for Catholics. And can you think of something that was farther removed from the needs, deep thinking of cottiers, labourers, small farmers, dying in their droves? And the Church of Ireland, similarly, I was looking at their capital expenditure programme during the Great Famine, and I do have to say, there are some ministers, particularly in West Cork, possibly in West Kerry as well. I usually spend part of the summer in Ballinarterry, Irish-speaking area in the Dingle Peninsula, and my feeling is that Protestant missionaries actually effectively helped many hundreds stay alive who otherwise would have starved there. Having said all of that, Church of Ireland also continued to spend, I worked it out one time, I think it was about 2 million in today's money, on building programs during the Great Famine. Again, one might wonder about other possibilities. And I think I'm into my last 30 seconds. If I can find it, I'd like to quote from a very eminent American historian of Ireland, perhaps the most eminent, John Atkinson, who does not suffer from cultural cringe or colonial cringe or whatever. And here he is speaking at the Ulster American Folk Park in Roma in 1995. I was in the audience. Incidentally, he did say to me, he said, "Oh, Liam, I'm looking forward to hearing your paper." I was on after him, because John left the room immediately with his paper, and I can well see why he wasn't bothered waiting around to hear what I had to say. Anyhow, this is Don Atkinson in 1995, September. One word, however, is not open to our usage. This is the term Holocaust. When you see it, you know that you are encountering famine porn. It is inevitably part of a presentation that is historically unbalanced, and like other forms of pornography, is distinguished by a covert and sometimes overt appeal to misanthropy, and almost always an incitement to hatred. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the question and answers here of the people. I'll just quickly recap on some of the points that were made. Yeah, so Tim started by talking about the overcrowding of the land, went into Trevelyan and other landed gentry, the buying of commissions within the army and civil service. Then went into the land clearances and a pretty grim quote about the Celts being as rare on the Shannon as the Red Indians on the Hudson. He went on to talk about the workhouses and the idea of peasantry versus industrial revolution progress. So then we went on to the whole idea of were these deaths natural causes, or were they due to evictions, the lack of clothing and the lack of access to food. He went then to talk about the era of 1845 to 1852, but also these deaths continued on decades after. You had the devastation and the decimation of the populations in the west of Ireland. You had accelerated mortality and the methodology of the official estimations of death and emigration. He went on to say that this was a deliberate policy of genocide and land clearances. It was one of the greatest crimes of the 19th century in Ireland and also the world. And we try in current times to deny this. This is part of, in his words, colonial cringe. Liam Kennedy went on to talk about, used up 1/3 of his time there on an unrelated anecdote, unfortunately. But then went into mentioning different aspects of it though as well, like how when we examine these subjects, they really are polarising and different aspects of society and sections of society have different ways of viewing these events. You have a past versus present subjectivity. He did agree it was one of the greatest traumatic events in Irish history. You had 1 million dead and 1 million fled. It also coincided with the decline of the native tongue due to the west of Ireland being the hardest hit and also being the most connected with the Irish language as well. He went on to quote that Marx also said that only poor devils fell victim during this era. And he went on to also talk about the intensivity and excess of mortality, which was 1 in 8 of the population, which is also one of the worst in any recorded famine event in world history. But he also went on to question some of the culpability as well. What is the definition of a genocide or Holocaust? And also went through the UN definition of it. He went on to say then that 1847 was also an election year, but these events were not an election issue. Daniel O'Connell and his supporters were more concerned with matters of constitutionality. You also had the Young Irelanders as well, had no real public policy regarding this. He went on to talk about disinformation about clerical deaths, the word deaths within the Catholic and the various Protestant ministries as well, but also highlighted that church building did not cease during this era as well. And many of the archbishops opposed the starving clergy leaving the island. So that's essentially it. We're going to go back into the crowd now as well, and I'd ask you to keep your points short, because we're going to be coming back to the 2 speaker stands here as well. So please don't go on too much of a solo run ramble here as well. So Patrick is going to take over from here, okay?
Thanks both of you for your contributions. I missed most of Tim Coogan's, but that's okay because I would take this side of the argument anyway. So I want you to hear the side against. And you spent very little time actually developing that point of refuting the arguments of intentionality. But in intentionality, we don't just look at the government, we look at the class. The ruling class in England, the class that actually ran the empire. And they were the ones who were quite clear. And their opinions were reflected in, not just in minister statements, but also private correspondence, in editorials in the London Times and the London Illustrated News and other periodicals at the time. It was quite clear that they wanted, at the very least, to eliminate the whole cottier class and possibly part of the Irish landlord class as well.
Just to say as well, we're going to give it back to the speakers after every two speakers.
I'd just like to make a point in name here. Not sure if you're aware, but the Day of Blood went all over Europe, and with people in order to only depend on today, there was plenty of other food, there was wheat, barley, meat. I'm just saying, I just want to make the point that there's no other country suffered starvation that every country suffered. So that's just the point I want to make.
Okay, so
Okay, the first one in terms of class analysis of what went on, I mean that point is well taken. I mean, there used to be, we're very familiar with the class structure of British society, rather less so about the class structure of Irish society in the 19th century. You know, the old notion of homogenous peasantry on the brink of subsistence. You know, that it is clearly much more complicated than that. It was quite a heavily socially graded society as well. Did the English ruling class, for want of a better term, wish to eliminate the courtier class? I think the answer to that is yes and no. Not in the sense of, the answer is very clearly no, not in the sense of starving them out or deliberately wishing to inflict mass suffering on the people. I think the answer is yes, if you think that some British policymakers perhaps most favoured a restructuring of the Irish economy and Irish society in the longer term. And indeed, many people within Ireland would have gone, in Bond's opinion, would have gone along with that. I mean, the ramshackle pre-famine economy just couldn't have gone on. Ideally, had there not been an ecological catastrophe of the kind that happened, and I'll come back to that point perhaps in a moment, the numbers of courtiers and labourers would have gradually diminished during the second half of the 19th century. Terrible thing is the famine compressed social change into an awful lot of social change into one terrible decade. But there was no future for the kind of, as I say, ramshackle rural economy that existed in Ireland in the 1840s. And we see that in other countries as well. I mean, Ireland isn't the only region in Europe which is losing population in the second half of the 19th century. The Highlands and Islands of Scotland, similarly. Other regions of continental Europe, that's, you know, where the future lay. On the second point, there was other food in Ireland. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case. There were livestock products which my friend, possibly a mutual friend, Christine Keneally, lays particular emphasis on. But if you talk to food scientists, they will say that potatoes and grain are the staples of the mass of the population throughout Europe. There was no other society in Europe which was as dependent on a single food, potato, as was Ireland. So when that crop failed, there really was an absolute shortage of food. I mean, if you listen to Arthur Griffith and others since his time, you know, talking about an artificial famine, there was plenty of food in Ireland and so on. I mean, that is simply not the case. Now, I would argue alternative policies were available, and I'll come back to that if anybody wants to raise it. But let me simply say that what really mattered in terms of feeding the people in the later 1840s was grain. And prior to the famine, on the eve of the famine, Ireland exported about close to 500,000 tonnes of grain. Grain was still exported during the famine, the kind of notorious grain exports that so much emphasis is laid on. But what's not emphasised sufficiently is that you had massive grain imports as well. And I can give you the figures. This is from PMA Burke, famous article on the grain trade. It's very hard to take in these figures. I can't, but you might be better able than mine. But 1846, first bad year of famine, the net outflow of grain has shrunk from about close to 500,000 down to under 100,000 tonnes. Now you could argue those 100,000 tonnes should have been retained, and indeed I would argue that. However, 1847 is a massive net inflow of grain, mainly from North America, 750,000 tonnes. So, if you're talking about food exports and other kinds of food, we need to look at both the export trade and also the import trade. Is it yeah, sure.
Well, there are a number of inaccuracies to be corrected. There's talk about O'Connellites and the rest not doing anything. First and foremost, remember, O'Connell and the other leaders of Ireland, Lord Mayor and so on, met with Lord Hastings, the Chief Secretary, in the outbreak of the famine, and they warned that what was needed was close the ports to the export of food, stop the distillation of alcohol from grain, borrow money on the Irish forests and distribute food. The other thing to bear in mind is that O'Connell was not the man he had been. He died in 47, a broken man, broken-hearted. How could he give the leadership he would have wanted to give? And I think that point should be borne in mind very strongly. On the question of grain exports or food exports, and the question of the government's attitude generally, as indeed with everything that's been said here tonight, does a government or does a government not have responsibility for its people? The Act of Union took away the Irish Parliament and exacerbated the famine out of all recognition. Instead of listening to the like of O'Connell and other leaders, son of Henry Grattan and so on, you had to go over the seas, slow mail of those days, to send letters to Whitehall, which ended up in the desk of a man like Trevelyan. That hardly makes for instantaneous aid, or even adequate aid. Out the outbreak of the famine, the then Conservative Prime Minister, Peel, had been, and this is a metaphor for the entire famine, he had been surreptitiously bringing in grain because of the corn laws. You couldn't bring it in because the squirearchy were getting a fortune for this cheap but very expensive grain they were producing behind the corn law tariff wall. He managed to dismantle it and get it out and destroy it, and he was brought down. But he was bringing in grain using the Baring brothers, bankers. And the very first thing Trevelyan did, his first action of any substance on taking over, with of course the connivance of his superiors, was to write to the Baring brothers and tell them they didn't want that grain, and the ship was actually turned back. And that is what they did from then on. We must remember, at the time we're talking about, the Liberals and laissez-faire in power, and we heard about the weakness of the Liberal government, it was more the weakness of the Liberal leader within the government you have to concern yourself with. Small man, in fact, he married a widow. He was known there afterwards by the wits as the widow's mite. He didn't have that much control over his cabinet, certainly not over hugely familiar with figures like Palmerston. Remember, the most important influential Irish landlords at the time were in the cabinet. You had Lord Monteagle, who was a humane by the other standards. He shone by his own light. But he was up against people like Lord Lansdowne, and in particular Clanricarde in the West. You know the song, The West's Awake. And surprised at Glory guards Clanricarde's grave. Lansdowne wasn't himself a particularly cruel man, but he was very much minded to listen to his agent, a man called Trench. And it was said the conditions that he exported his tenants in, Trench did it for him, it's cheaper than paying for the Union. The press of the time, the New York papers are there, and you can look it up. They said that the most ragged and wretched and appalling famine victims to land in New York were from his estate in Kerry. Palmerston's people landed there are cases in Canada of a woman landing naked, and they were just treated with complete contempt. And at the time there was an institution known as the London Political Club, and they had done their analysis of that problem, which was the overpopulation, people living on scraps of land. It was a shambles, absolutely crazy. And they said that 1 million deaths wouldn't be enough. When it was over, Russell wrote that in fact he was informed by the London Political Club, this is the Prime Minister, that 2 million would be nearer the mark. And then, by a wondrous act of providence, the whole situation was resolved. The government used the catastrophe to further its subterranean, and in particular, 4 peoples, 4 major cabinet ministers. Of course, the landlords, not all of them. The idea of the Irish landlord being universally horrific is not quite true. A lot of them are just wasteful, second generation and so on, drunken and living abroad, living on rents and Dieppe and places like that. The money was spent not in Ireland, as far as improving the land. Yes. But the overall responsibility rests with the government. Now we talk about the churches. I think it is I'm glad the point is made about Protestants and Catholic clergy dying. It was a Protestant clergyman, Trail was his name, down in West Cork, who brought the London Illustrated News into West Cork to show him the situation, the deaths and people dying. And his reports, as a freelance writer, could also draw from Mahoney. And that's what started public opinion off. And Dr. Trail, who had brought him in, actually died of famine fever, as a lot of clergy at the time did. But that's not to exculpate the senior clergy or the hierarchy who took their tone. Remember, this is something that you should be very familiar with in our day. The ordinary decent Irish person, decent young clergyman, and so forth, all decent bishop. Most of the money that was spent by the Irish in famine relief came from the Irish in America. And it came through Dr. Murray, the Archbishop in Dublin. And it was generous and it was well spent. There's no question of it being misappropriated. But during this time, the papacy was under pressure from the French, and you had at the time of the Babylonian captivity of the Church, of the Pope, as they said, and the Irish hierarchy were told by Rome to draw up a collection. And in the middle of the famine, the hierarchy, under the tutelage of the hierarchy of Rome, they collected some millions and sent it out of the country for the poor fleeing Pope. Very much the situation you've seen here in your own lives, child abuse. The ordinary Irish bishop and priest wanted a policy of reportage and send them to the cops. But the bishops were told from Rome by a cardinal to Hoyas, this was a worldwide policy, pass the parcel, keep it quiet, don't provoke the scandal, that the duty of bishops to their priests was to act as fathers, not policemen. Now the power of Rome in this era was far stronger than it was then. And that should be borne in mind. They could have done a lot more than build churches and so on. But it is not true just to say that food was not exported. The man who had the very apt title of Pine Coffin, he was part of a very important English family, and it was his duty to look after welfare in Scotland when the very minor potato failure, well, it wasn't a minor potato failure, it was a failure. The effect was minor, and one of the reasons it was minor was he immediately went down to the port, commandeered British warships, and distributed grain up and down to the famine areas. The same Pine Coffin during the famine was down in Limerick. He was watching shiploads of grain, eggs, butter, every form of food known going out of the country and couldn't stop it. He was subregnant to the liberals, laissez-faire and Trevalian. And that again was straight governmental policy and should be borne in mind. There are so many things that you could take. I don't know what the point is. I don't know what point there is in going along with it, but it is government. You're talking about a government here. You're trying to diminish the responsibility. You're saying it was the church, or it was this fellow, or that fellow should have done more, and of course they all should. But overall, the government of the time said, Providence has decided, and certainly the most clear statement on Providence and the effect on solving an economic problem was Trevalian's. That the effectiveness of the Irish, and he talked about their lack of character and so forth, and their obscurantisms and so on, and Providence has provided a light on the horizon, solving the situation. And the light on the horizon led to mass graves, emigration, in horrific conditions, coffin ships, to every form. And the bitterness of it still has an effect today. And it is true that the Unionists do regard, still regard 16 or any mark of assertion on the other side as subversive or as causing hatred and so on. But there were an awful lot of Protestants died in Belfast. There's still famine graves in the heart of Belfast. It's a situation which, because of its size, because of the impact on the country, it deserves to be looked at in the round. Nobody should take pleasure from it. Remember this, it was so important that the peace process, whether some of you people agree with it or not, it began when Tony Blair apologised for the famine, because it did weigh on the conscience of decent English people, of whom there were many.
I addressed it to Liam. I suppose as an academic, most of the people you teach in the class, you get them to read the question properly, address the key points, and get straight. Don't faff around the points so much. I thought the first thing that you said that it didn't really address the point so much. So I'd like to ask a fairly direct question instead. When I think Tim Pat brought it up earlier on, if you're living next door to pretty much the centre of invention nearly in the world around the time, who could pretty much achieve anything they wanted to do, is the question, is the fact that a famine happened in Ireland out of neglect, as in people don't care, or is it actually out of a policy-driven decision? Which of the two?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and be as direct as possible. Though, could I say, the reason we're having this discussion this evening is because the famine still has resonance in the Ireland of 2016. I don't think it's a case of malevolence. There is certainly neglect. There's policies which weren't persisted with for long enough. Soup kitchen initiative was by and large a good one, and could and should have been extended over a longer time period. However, we do have to bear in mind the constraints on policy making, and it is true that Charles Wood, Chancellor of the Exchequer, was worried, particularly following a financial crisis in 1846-47, was worried about dangers to the finances of the United Kingdom state as a whole. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say those fears were exaggerated, but they were real at the time and they did guide policy making. The other thing which heavily guided policy making was the laissez-faire ideology of the time. I mean, Trevelyan, and I would agree with those who say if you want to pick out a single individual who's particularly important in terms of the famine relief story, it is Trevelyan. But at the end of the day, he was a civil servant. Power lay ultimately with political decision makers. But Trevelyan and many others would have thought that interfering with market processes was not only a bad thing in itself, but was actually counterproductive. So if you believe that state intervention in food markets is likely to lead to a worse result, i.e., that is, more people will die, then it makes sense not to implement state intervention. Again, with the benefit of hindsight and Keynesianism and so on, we would argue very differently nowadays. But I think one of the tasks of the historian is to enter into the minds of the people and the key decision makers at the time and, consider their motives, their understanding of the situation. Can I also add, there was also as I argue in my book, there was ruthless self-interest at play on the part of Irish landlords, those who didn't do their duty, as it were, by their tenants. Incidentally, a final point perhaps on this, the Whig Liberal government, the people they blamed primarily for the Great Famine was not the Irish cottiers, labourers, small farmers, what's sometimes loosely referred to as the Irish peasantry. The people they really blamed was the Irish landlord class. And, their arguments weren't wholly specious. The Irish landlord class had an income of 12 millions per annum, annually. Sorry, 12 millions annually. So, viewed from London, you could see some substance in the charge that Irish land, Irish property, should pay for Irish poverty. The tragedy, of course, is that that's not the kind of policy to implement in the midst of a famine.
Yeah, okay, we'll take the last couple of points here because we're getting close to the time, and I just want to say, we're going to finish off as well with a song from David Bartnock as well, okay, but we're going to take just the last round of feedback here, please.
It's Michael Blanche here. Just in fact corrected Liam's point about O'Connell. He made a statement saying that part of the population would be cleared out if there wasn't action taken. But leading on to the Young Irelanders had a rebellion, and it was given that we got the flag, our tricolour, out of that famine rebellion in 1848 in Ballingarry in County Tipperary, where Thomas Francis Meagher brought the tricolour back, a present from the French people after their rebellion. So it's very important that the Young Irelanders aren't airbrushed out of your points on that issue as regards the famine rebellion, which then led on to 1916, which was the first time the tricolour was used in battle. It was 1848, 29th of July, 1848. But that was just the point to clarify and correct.
Could just comment on that very quickly. when I was talking about O'Connell, I think Tim Paddy misrepresents me a bit. I'm talking about the O'Connellite party. Daniel O'Connell himself spoke heartbrokenly in the House of Commons, but his party, and there's about 40 of them, do not come out, they did not have a good famine. Could I also say on the tricolour, you can't eat tricolours in times of famine.
What's that name?
You can't eat tricolours in times of famine.
Yeah, obvious statement. And what I wanted to say about was that people here may not be aware that we have a National Famine Memorial Day to remember famine victims. But also, there's 2 points that, and the amnesia, the national and international amnesia, in relation to An Gorta Mor, or the famine, is the National Museum of Ireland has no record, no exhibition, has absolutely nothing to An Gorta Mor. We have been on a 10-year campaign now to ask them to do something about it. You go into the National Gallery, the art gallery, absolutely zero on it. I was shown 3 paintings, it didn't depict the famine. It was absolutely zero. A big fat man, 20 stone, he said, that's related to the famine, that's an eviction. He's not sitting on a hill with 20 stone. Anyway, he showed me another one with British, the uniform, Red Army uniform going to a village. Could have been any time in Irish history where the British were here. The next one was ships in a bay. Could have been anything, could have been any time. Same again. Anyway, so the 2 points is about the National Museum have a responsibility and a duty to do something about it. 0. The National Gallery have a responsibility to do it and highlight and let the people know, the Irish people know, and the tourists that come into this country, most importantly, who are scattered 70 million of them around the world, know what the effect the famine had on what happened to Ireland. And just the last note, final note, Ireland is the only country in the world that its population has not grown since the 19th century. That's some figure, and that's some Olympic gold medal that we wouldn't want to hold, but we do hold it. Thanks.
May I also add as well that the medium of photography was at least 10 years old at this stage and not one photograph exists. I find it hard to believe personally that the British intelligence or the British state weren't using photography to send information back from the colonial outposts.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question of Liam Kennedy talking about the O'Connellites not not talking about the famine during the election year and these kinds of issues, but surely in a period before 1872, before the Secret Ballot Act, at a time where if you spoke out against your landlord you were going to be kicked off the land, the relevance of a party that essentially represents the establishment that existed in Westminster, it doesn't really take away culpability from the Parliament in Westminster, the fact that Irish politicians or politicians that were supposed to be representing Irish people weren't talking about these issues. Surely it reflects the fact that the system wasn't working for the mass of Irish people during those famine years, and that it was a failure of the system, a failure of the Union. Irish people weren't being properly represented at that time.
Hello, thanks very much for your talk tonight. You mentioned An Gorta earlier, and indeed he is a fine historian on famine in general and the Irish in particular. And he comes down on the line that it's serious recklessness and negligence. But in law, the penal prison sentence for criminal negligence and recklessness can be equivalent or greater, whether it was intent. If you're a fairground attraction owner and 200 people get killed, they come up and arrive, you can be dealt with severely by the law. So I think that the prison sentence at the end could be equivalent or greater. Secondly, there wasn't seen as people. There was this legal act of union in 1800, and a few years just after the famine, they spent a lot of money sending a lot of people in the room would probably have difficulty finally on the globe up until 2 years ago, before the problem with Ukraine and Russia, which ended in the Crimean War. So when they felt it was important, they could muster their resources to send people, the equivalent to going to the moon in today's world, going to the Crimean back then. And you mentioned about woods, being worried about a crisis. Anybody's worried about a problem in their own constituency or family, they don't stop spending money on their own citizens, their own family, but the Irish to an illegal act of union in 1800. So that's one, do you agree with my point about the negligence, and secondly, do you think the act of union in 1800 would have had a massive difference? I think Tim alluded to it earlier, that you would have had you would have had a younger O'Connell in control probably in Ireland in the 1830s, 40s, and a more powerful structure that could have addressed the crisis as it arrived, along with everything else in Irish America and so on and so forth.
Do you want me to answer? Just take two more points here. This man
Tim has just one question. Why does historians like Liam and others want to break famine? Do they feel there's something great about it? Because you don't call the Ethiopian famine great. I feel that the policies of the famine are still carried on in this country. I don't know how people are being depopulated out of this country. Like some English fellas, Celtic, west of the Shannon, around the Shannon, Irish people are still being depopulated out of Ireland, and other people being brought in. And that's part of the famine policy.
It's just that in the course of my work as a historian, I have had the opportunity to actually realise that the famine was not restricted to Ireland, that this particular strain of potato blight. Tim Pat mentioned the Highlands of Scotland. It also affected Belgium, seriously, and Prussia to a degree, France to a lesser, they're interesting in so much as to see how did they react to this. We have to start by allowing the percentage of land that was devoted to potatoes in Ireland. It was way, way, way beyond the percentages that were devoted in, say, Belgium or Prussia. Or the Western Highlands were particularly vulnerable, where 200,000 people relied on the potato crop. When the potato crop failed in Western Highlands, of all people, London did nothing, of course. The Free Church of Scotland organised a massive relief scheme, as did the Scottish diaspora in Canada. That was pretty much which saved 200,000 lives in Western Scotland. Belgium, Prussia's losses up to 40,000 died in Prussia, the western part of Prussia that would be bordering the Low Countries. Again, central administration in Berlin did very little. Belgium is a much more interesting case study in so much as, and this is the same blight, this was 1845, 1846, because this blight spread right across Western Europe. Scandinavia didn't really impact too much because they didn't rely on the potato. So you have to confine it to proportion of land devoted to potato growth, percentage of dependence. Belgium is interesting, and Flanders was the one region where they relied very heavily on the potato crop as opposed to the other areas of the country. Belgium had become an independent, a constitutional monarchy 1830-31. So this is now the Belgian government dealing with their own people. Flanders was neglected to the point where just under 50,000 people died of potato famine in Flanders, with pretty much zero help from Brussels. This is just, I bring these figures, as I say, it's just to, when one contextualizes it, is that it was not just an Irish phenomenon, it was a Western European phenomenon, and the reaction of the respective regimes is pertinent to our own situation.
Liam, you made the point there about the Westminster policy that they didn't want subsistence farmers in Ireland, that they wanted to change that. So, my point on this is that we think that Westminster actually used the famine, the potato blight, as to use the pull on the Irish population to get rid of what they didn't want, basically.
Just two very brief points. The power of Rome, I think, has been mentioned, but also social conditions within England. Also, there was no democracy anywhere, Irish or English. In all reality, in 1918, women got the vote was a step towards full democracy. But in 1847, I think it was 40-shilling freeholders were the only people who were allowed, if they were male, have a vote, and they had to be leaseholders, tenants. So that's about 15% of the population was the total electorate that you have referred to. No mention of the Chartists, who in England were bringing up the dire social conditions brought about by the Industrial Revolution. And I don't think the English government knew anything about how to handle that at all. But one thing they did know, punish the Irish, and the English will read about it. And they know if they start piping up for extra wages, education, health, housing, or anything else, they may end up like the Irish. And to bring it up to today's context, what's the big call-out? Who do we listen to? Brussels, Washington, or who? And I'm telling you, the social conditions in this country are dire, on the verge of another revolution. And absolutely nothing to do with the Vatican, England, London, Lord Harberson, the civil service, or nobody else, but the present day corporate sense that neoliberalism, good, social attitude, social justice, bad. Simple as that.
Hello. Just a quick observation, obviously. I came here with an open mind myself tonight, and one thing that also struck me about the famine and the lack of official recognition of the scale of it was there obviously is a huge, overwhelming residual guilt that pervades the entire country and must have from the time immediately after the famine. People must look around and said, we made it, those poor efforts on the bottom of the scale didn't. You know, that the residual guilt has pervaded right through to the present day, I would say, and that would be hugely indicative in every way, in official response, even if you go into areas that were very badly affected by the famine, people just didn't like to talk about it for decades and for many years after the tragedy. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to let Liam and Tim just finish off here now briefly enough, okay? I'll take some of these points.
Thank you very much. That was a very rich discussion and set of questions. I'll only pick up on as many as I can remember at this stage, and maybe pick up on others. So apologies if I can't, in this massive notes, pick out all of the points you mentioned. That would probably be pleased I won't be able to. Maybe to begin at the beginning, the residual guilt. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think a lot more needs to be done on the psychological legacies of the Great Famine, the silences. Certainly there are silences in the Irish folklore where you might expect, popular attitudes to come through. Remember, those of us who are descendants of the survivors of the famine, which is many of us in this room probably, we don't know what our forefathers, foremothers did in the 1840s. And I come of farming stock. I don't know what my great-great-grandfather or whatever did. Did he tuft his cottiers out on the roadside? I just don't know. But there was certainly good reason for men, especially from the farming class, not to think too closely of the family. And actually, just to say very quickly, there's a wonderful account by Grandal Moxivna, or Moxina, depending which Irish dialect you use, from Donegal, talking about on An Gorta Mor Island, where a farmer, aided by his wife, cuts the ear off a local labouring woman who steals, I think it's potatoes, from his pit. And he's in the process of cutting the other ear off, but it doesn't quite manage to do that. So there are very dark sides to the Great Famine, what happened in Irish society, and that just doesn't come through in the oral tradition to any great extent. The point about voters and the narrow franchise, yes, I agree very much. It was actually narrower than 40 shilling freeholders. You had to have a land valuation or a property valuation of £10 by the 1840s to vote. So it's a very narrow franchise. And had Irish society been organised on more democratic lines in the 1840s, then famine policies would be different. But, you know, we're talking about Europe, not just in Ireland, where the franchise is narrow. And, of course, in southern and eastern Europe, there is no franchise. It's almost purely authoritarian societies. So, in a way, it's almost a bit like wishing, you know, they had computers then, would have helped, but it's, you know. However, I take the substance of the point, though, and it is the case, looking at famine in the 19th and 20th centuries, the societies which are more democratic are less likely to be vulnerable to famine. The point, the European comparative perspective, which the speaker here gives a nice panoramic view of, that is enormously important. I think that's one of the ways forward in terms of contextualising the Irish famine. You might throw in the Netherlands as well. My recollection is the Netherlands stuck to a laissez-faire policy, whereas the Belgians were more interventionist, or alternatively the other way around. The two adopted quite different policies, which you know, is interesting in itself, I think. Why the Great Famine? Nothing great about it. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know when the term the Great Famine was first coined. That would be worth exploring. Of course, it was a horrific episode in Irish history. Yeah, on the coffin ships, which came up at various points. I mean, it is the case, and I've been to Gross Evil. The condition in which Irish immigrants landed in Gross Evil was appalling. But remember, that was one season of the Great Famine. Joel Mokier, one of the, perhaps next to Conor McGrath, one of the great students of the Irish famine, Joel is, what is he, he's either Belgian or Dutch, Israeli, American, and Jewish. So no Irish connections whatsoever. But he makes the point that you cannot generalise images of coffin ships to the massive exodus of the Irish people during the 1840s. In fact, the vast majority of people leaving Ireland in the later 1840s, beginning of the 1850s, arrived safely in the New World, some more debilitated than others. And indeed, here's a statistic which is astonishing, that German migrants to North America had higher mortality rates, and they weren't typically fleeing famine, than Irish migrants. So the transatlantic trade, for all its limitations, worked, I mean, moderately well by the standards of the time, and succeeded in reducing famine mortality. It was one of the escape routes out of Ireland. And a final point, and I'm sorry I haven't picked up on many of the others. Possibly the single best article on the Great Famine is by another American historian, Peter Solar. I can't remember if Tim Harris used it or not. But Peter Solar makes the point that what happened in Ireland in the 1840s, in terms of back-to-back food failure, 4-5 years in a row, that was absolutely unprecedented in terms of European history. So when the luck of the Irish ran out, it ran out disastrously.
I think nearly everything that could be said has been said. I don't want to keep you here. I'm sure some of you want to go into the novena and others might want to go for a pint. Just a couple of points. It's interesting why somebody says, why was it called Great? Why was the First World War called the Great War? There's no rhyme nor reason to these things. Going back to the vulnerability of the people, which in turn placed all the responsibility on the shoulders of the London government, it should be said fairly that the great boon, allegedly, of Catholic emancipation wasn't such a boon, because they lost the 40 shilling freeholders, went up to 10 shilling, or 10 pounds. So the electorate was very denatured, their ability to do anything. The genius of O'Connell was that he got that handful, 40 members or so, if he had 40, of the O'Connellite party out of 105, and he managed to do what he did. It was colossal. Without his leadership and his confidence and his energy, there wasn't any constitutional reply really to the famine. And I would just call to your attention again the fact that they had to apply to another jurisdiction where they had a hostile ideology, laissez-faire, the liberal thing. They had a totally hostile, effectively the government was the government. The policy to hand up the Baronet's Club was Charles Trevelyan, and the Irish got what they got. Now the relevance of the famine today, if you want to learn from history, just go back shortly. You're hearing a situation, we have it now, where on the radio you hear economic discussions. None of you have ever heard the word suicide mentioned in these discussions. GNP and strange figures are given. It's dehumanized. But all of that and the increase in suicide that happened when a government just abrogated its responsibilities. There was a raison d'être amongst the important people, the decision takers, the lawyers, the accountants, civil servants, the bankers, the directors. And effectively we lost our government and had to go to another government in Brussels, and really behind them the German bankers. And that's the message to learn and to take from it. Not much point in debating the rights and wrongs, but the outcome is, keep an eye on your vote. There's an election coming, and bear in mind when you vote, do you want a government that's going to do something for you and your children, your parents in this country, or do you want to be ruled from Brussels? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, we're going to finish off with a song from Dermot Batnock. Dermot will give you a bit of background to the song, and I'd just like to remind people, if you could help us with a donation or buy a badge. We also have tickets for sale for our function on Easter Sunday evening as well. I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight. It's been a brilliant contribution. Thanks very much for keeping us civil as well. It's been really good.
This song was written actually during the famine years. It's first published in the United States. It's an immigrant a discussion between an immigrant and his son, but I've changed it to a discussion between an immigrant and his daughter. There's one verse in it I've left out in which his wife collapses during the eviction, and my experience of women is they're a lot stronger than that, so I've left that one out. But revisioning, yes. But healthy revisions, I hope. It is still revisionism, and all history is revisionism. And here's a comment to both of you and to all of you. All of our history is important, not just 1916. It tells us what we are and tells us what we've been, of how we have come to the now, of those who struggled and those who bowed in the struggle to be free, through the bloody ages, down through the pages, and whispers to us what we can yet be. Oh, Father dear, I oft times hear you speak of Aaron's her lofty scenes, her valleys green, her mountains rude and wild. They say she is a lovely land, wherein a prince might dwell. Oh, why did you abandon her? The reason to me tell. My girl I loved, my native land, with energy and pride. But then the blight came over my crops, my sheep and cattle died. My rent and taxes were to pay, and I could not them redeem. And that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen. Oh, well do I remember that bleak December day, that Sheriff and his bailiffs came to drive us all away. They set my roof on fire with their cursed yellow spleen. And that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. And 12 to 8, and you were only 2 years old, and feeble was your frame. I could not leave you with my friends, for you bore your father's name. I wrapped you in my Gorta Mor, and up dead of night unseen. I heaved a sigh and bade goodbye to dear old Skibbereen. And well do I remember the year of 48, when I rose with comrades brave and true to battle against fate. We were haunted through the hills by slaves who served a foreign queen. And that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. Oh, Father dear, the day will come when in answer to your call, each Irishman with feelings high will rally one and all. I'll be the one to lead the band beneath a flag of green, and loud and high we'll raise
raise the cry, revenge for Skibbereen.
Yeah, and also there's events on tomorrow on the 21st for basically our own official Independence Day around Dublin, so look out to the usual sources for those, okay?